for our Western New York COVID-19 Business Impact Survey. We are really privileged to have you all with us here today as we share with you the results of what is, I think, going to be a very important foundational piece as we begin to plan the recovery of our region from the effects of the pandemic. So let's get started. With me here on the call are our research partners from MOER and Laura Smith, our Vice President of Economic Development. And we will be all sort of talking at you here as we go through this. Before we begin the presentation, I want to pause and remind everyone here that this is an incredible effort from 16 community partners and the governments of Erie and Niagara County and the City of Buffalo and the City of Niagara Falls, who all came together for the benefit of this community to really to make this meaningful. And Katie is going to go into a lot of the details, but just on a very top line, we were able to get results that are impressive and representative of the marketplace completely, both by industry and by size. So we're excited to begin the conversation, the dialogue of what's next. So as I mentioned, our partners from MOER, Doug Bean, the Vice Chairman and Chief Brand Officer for MOER, and Katie Bender, the Research Director. Doug and MOER have been a member of the partnership for many years. Doug serves on our board, and I had asked him to take a look at the survey draft that Laura Smith put together. Laura had been researching best practices from around the country, and Doug not only took a look at the survey, but agreed to have MOER actually conduct the actual survey and the analytics of the survey. And I can honestly say it would not be where it is without the incredible work of MOER and Laura Smith. So thank you again for your pro bono contribution to the future of this community. So thank you both. So I'm going to turn it over now to Katie Bender, the Research Director, who's going to walk us through the survey results. And I will remind you all, I don't think we're going to have much time for Q&A, but certainly you can reach out to us with any questions you may have, and there'll be a way to reach out to us that we'll show you at the end of the presentation. So Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Dottie. This is just a quick overview of the methodology that we approached. As Dottie mentioned, her and Laura were interested in exploring the impact of COVID-19 on area businesses. They did pull together a survey questionnaire based on several other national studies and wanted to understand what the specific impact on Western New York was. And that's where we at MOER became involved. Most of you are familiar with the survey, I believe. It took everybody about 10 minutes on average to complete the survey. And then, of course, our sample was created through the lists that were shared through all those partner organizations that were on that previous slide. And then the Buffalo Niagara Partnership had an intake form where people essentially applied to get an invitation to the survey as well. And those went out on a daily basis. We sort of pulled in the responses from the day. And then the next day they would get an invitation. We were in field from April 14th to April 28th. And we had a total of 1,865 respondents. Most of those were in Erie County, followed by Niagara County and counties outside of Erie and Niagara, most of which fell within Western New York, but some went a little easterly to sort of the Finger Lakes region as well. So the way that the survey was structured is that we have a couple of questions up front that really just dig into the types of businesses that we were looking at so that we could understand what some of those different segments might look like later on. The vast majority of the information here is detailed at that total level. So for all of the respondents across the region, we did use some of the segment information that we'll cover in the next few slides to look at specific differences that came out. It is not an exhaustive list necessarily. As Dottie mentioned, there is going to be a little bit more robust information that could potentially be available later on, but this is largely based on the sort of overall region results that we have here. So the first thing that we wanted to explore was what industry each of these respondents fell into. The largest proportion were in professional services. That can include anything from a hairdresser to a law firm, to an architect and engineer. So sort of a large spectrum, certainly there in terms of categories, you know, it's a wide range of different businesses that could fall in there. The next highest category was retail, then construction, manufacturing, not-for-profit after that.
For this slide, for folks on the call, just so you understand that the percentages do align with the industry percentage across the 8-county region of Western New York. So 7% restaurants, 5% hospitality and tourism, that all lines up with the number of businesses in our community. As Katie had mentioned, we're slightly high on the professional services, and also of note is construction. And that's due to, for construction, the robust list that we had from our partner at the Construction Exchange, and the professional services, most likely due to the number of partners we had in the government sector reaching out to neighborhood retail business associations, as well as the Chamber of Commerce partners on the call reaching out to their members in that space. But other than those two blips of overrepresentation, it is matching up with our community.
Thanks, Laura. The next piece of information we were interested in is the type of organization. The vast majority of our businesses were for-profit organizations, 71% there. And then we have sort of an even distribution of those that are not for-profit, and then people that fall into sort of an independent worker category. So these might be people that are contractors or freelance, or someone who's a sole proprietor who doesn't have any additional employees in their firm. Another 4% indicated they were some other type of organization. Next, we wanted to explore how many of the businesses responding were deemed essential in New York State. We were a little surprised to see that nearly half of businesses responding to the study indicate that they do have approval for essential status in New York State. Another 5% indicate that they aren't currently classified as essential, but are intending to apply to receive that essential status. And that leaves, just under 50% who are not essential.
Katie, before you move on
Sure.
to the next businesses, I want to say the time in which we did the survey from April 14th to the 24th was intentional in that we wanted the stimulus package to be announced so that we would understand where the gaps were between what the stimulus package was going to provide and what businesses needed. And when you saw on the last slide the distribution of for-profit and not-for-profit, that is also representative of the marketplace in terms of the total number of business.
Thanks, Abby. Next, we wanted to explore the number of employees, so the size of businesses from an employee scenario. So again, about 20% of those businesses were sole proprietors, so one singular employee. And then you'll see here the vast majority of our respondents, 81% of businesses have 50 employees or fewer. So certainly talking to sort of the smaller end of the business spectrum here. The next highest category, once we get into the largers, is 51 to 150 employees.
Yeah, and once again on this slide, we are representative of the company size in our community in the 8-county region. We were slightly over on the 500 plus, only by 2 percentage points, and slightly under in the 51 to 150 range. And again, that was only a couple of percentage points. So really, when you look at the data results of this survey, you can feel confident that it is representative of our community.
The last area that we wanted to capture was based on location. So as we talked about on that very first slide, 80% of the businesses were responding from Erie County, 14 from Niagara County, and then 7% from counties outside of those two, but still largely in Western New York. Buffalo was the largest sort of individual town represented, followed by Amherst and Cheektowaga. The other category at the bottom, that represents 76 individual towns for whom there was 1% or fewer of responses. So if you sort of consolidate all of them together, it gives you sort of another 20% of respondents, but it represents, again, 76 individual towns in the Western New York region. So the first sort of set of business questions that we asked were around general business operations. And the very first question we wanted to explore were, what are the most pressing short-term concerns that the business has as a result of COVID-19? And there were about 16 response categories that they could select from here. We asked them to pick their top 5. So certainly all of them at some level will be some kind of a concern, but we really wanted to understand how the businesses were sort of distinguishing as the most important. In order to sort of consolidate our results here and display those that are most important, we sort of cut off the responses around 20%. So you can see the category that gets the highest number of responses, nearly 80% in terms of short-term concerns that are plaguing our businesses most, is a decline in revenue and sales, followed closely by cash flow. The next 3 and 4 are employee safety and well-being, and then a little over a third are concerned about cash reserves. About a quarter of our businesses are concerned with cancellation of events or large gatherings. their ability to make rent, lease, or mortgage payments, and then about 20% with that loss of employees, the business at risk of permanently closing, or debt relief and management. And on this next slide is where we start to look at some of the differences between those segments. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that stand out as notable and relevant. So businesses that are more concerned with employee safety, not necessarily surprising here, are businesses that have been deemed essential. So those are people whose employees have been working, for the entirety of the pause. Those in manufacturing, and those with larger businesses, so 51 employees or more. The businesses more concerned with cancellation of events, conferences, and large gatherings are not-for-profits. They have, large in-person fundraising events, perhaps. Non-essential businesses, sole proprietors, and those in the hospitality tourism industry. And then lastly, the people most concerned with rent, lease, or mortgage payments, again, those sole proprietors where, those kinds of bills may be a large proportion of the revenue that they may see, and then non-essential businesses as well. We wanted to know if the differences between concerns was different in the short term versus the long term. So we asked this question essentially 2 times. So this next question is, what are their most pressing concerns in the long term? It's the same list of responses, those same 16 categories that they could pick from. Again, we asked them to pick their top 5. And what we found was that the concerns largely were the same. So again, the number 1 concern is that decline in revenue and sales followed by cash flow. The only difference really that we saw here was that employee safety and well-being sort of drops down to the number 4 position, and cash reserves moves up to that sort of number 3 position. But aside from that, essentially everything else is the exact same story in terms of a quarter of the people around those cancellation of events and rent, lease, mortgage payment, and about 20% of people for those remaining 3. Also similarities between the segment differences, so we didn't add that here, but the call outs that we saw on the previous slide are consistent for these long-term concerns as well. Next, we wanted to understand whether businesses have postponed any investment decisions, and that would include capital or otherwise. And what we saw was that nearly 60% of businesses indicate that they have postponed investments at some level. We were curious whether or not that had a timeline assigned to it. So we were trying to get to whether or not these are sort of subsequent quarters in 2020, if this was out into 2021, or if the postponements were indefinite. And that farthest left-hand category you can see there is the highest. So 30% of those businesses, half of them that are postponing their investments, are in fact postponing them indefinitely. They are not sure when those investments will sort of come back online. Another 23% of our businesses say that they have not yet postponed anything, but they may need to. So it's sort of on the table as an option for them. This is a pretty large amount of people indicating that that postponements will be taking place for their business.
Just want to add here that this is an area of concern for me looking forward, because when you talk about investments, that really talks about how soon are we going to get back to normal. Those investments feed other people's supply chains, buying of equipment or doing projects. So this is if I had to say what's the bad news slide, this is not great news. I think there is some relief when we look at the mid-size and larger businesses, maybe not as severely as some of the smaller businesses, which we'll talk about. But this is really about talking about how quickly are we going to come out of this as a community.
Thanks, Debbie. And then we also explored this by segment. So more likely to postpone overall, so sort of any of those postponement categories are for-profit businesses versus our not-for-profits. Those more likely to postpone indefinitely are smaller organizations, so 10 employees or less. And those more likely to postpone into 2021, so the next calendar year, tend to be those in the restaurant industry. Next, we wanted to explore beyond investment if there was impact on revenue projected through the end of 2021. So our question was, through the end of December 31st, 2020, whether revenue will be is anticipated to be impacted. And you'll see it's a pretty dramatic response here. So only 4% of our businesses anticipate no change in revenue through the end of 2020. 93%, so nearly every single business that we got a response from anticipates some level of decline. We did break that down into different levels of a percentage decline. Most of them fall, certainly about half fall into that category of 1 to 50% of a decline. Fewer are in that sort of higher level category, but certainly a very large percentage of people indicating that their business anticipates a decline in 2020.
On this slide, this obviously was not a surprise, but what was a bit of a surprise is that if you looked at originally, about half of the businesses were essential and half were non-essential. So what this slide tells us is even if you're essential and you're open, your revenue is most likely off. So that is just something to pay attention to as we try to get back to full employment and full productivity.
When we look at these results by segment, more likely to anticipate a decline, again, sort of overall, just for-profit businesses versus not-for-profit. Those more likely to anticipate a significant decline, so anything sort of over 50%. Our sole proprietors and our restaurants are more likely to indicate a 76 to 100% decline. Those in hospitality and tourism, a 51 to 75%. The businesses that are more likely to anticipate a low or moderate decline are our larger organizations. So those with 151 employees or more, they're anticipating a 1 to 25% decline overall. Of the people who indicated that there would be some level of a decline, we wanted to understand which actions the company was taking to manage the impact on the bottom line. Vast majority, 75%, indicate that they are applying for or are planning to apply for any of the recovery stimulus incentives, whether it's PPP, SBA loans, anything they can get their hands on from a stimulus perspective, they're certainly applying for. Another half indicate that they are reducing variable costs, 43% reducing fixed costs, and a little over a third exploring new revenue sources and pricing. We also have the creation of new products at 14%. So, when you think about restaurants offering to-go and delivery services where they didn't before, or brick and mortar retail trying to get their products online so that they can still continue to interact with their businesses. Certainly the exploration of new revenue sources and the creation of new products tend to fall into those categories. Only 5% of businesses are not currently taking any action to sort of mitigate that impact of a revenue decline. Those are more likely to be sole proprietors. So we certainly learned that some of those stimulus incentives are not necessarily applicable to our sole proprietors, so they're sort of unable to take some of these actions as a result of what's available. Also, certainly the nature of their business may not allow for new products or different revenue sources. We were also interested in exploring whether or not businesses were prepared to work remote and what their level of flexibility was in trying to sort of pull a plan together once the New York State pause went into effect. So on the left-hand side here, we had, as of March 23rd, when pause went into effect, what was your readiness for your business to work remote? About 45% of our businesses indicated that they had at least some level of preparedness for staff to work remotely. Another third were not ready. And then 20% indicated that they were an essential industry where most of their employees are at work already, so there wasn't really a need to have a remote plan in place. So for those who were not 100% ready, we wanted to know, in the time since pause has started, were they able to get a plan together to cover staff to go remote? About half of them were in fact able to get some level of a plan together, whether that covers everyone or whether that covers only some of their employees. Certainly the nature of some businesses, maybe administrative staff can go to a remote working arrangement, but if it's a distribution or a warehouse or something in manufacturing, obviously those people would still need to be on site. So a work from home or a remote plan just isn't applicable for those people. 20% indicate that they do still not have a functioning remote work plan in place. And then another quarter indicate that they're unable to do work remotely. So in the previous question, we accounted for those essential employees that can't work remote. But in this question, we had a lot of people saying, we're not an essential business, but we are required to sort of be on site. Remote work is not a possibility. I'm a photographer. I can't do work remote. I can't shoot senior pictures. I can't shoot weddings, from my living room. So those are areas where the nature of their business just prevents them from having a remote working plan in place. Some differences here by segment. Those not at all ready to work remote, so businesses who hadn't sort of started exploring this option previously, are those sole proprietors, are smaller organizations with 50 employees or less in those restaurants. Those more likely to still not have a functioning remote plan in place, again, are those sole proprietors. So these singular employees, people who are a one-man show, they are sort of not really able to figure out a plan. Again, could be the nature of their business, just not possible, but they're having more of a challenge in trying to figure out how to make the current environment work for them. Workforce impacts, so sort of following the trail from level of investment to revenue to working from home. Now, what have we done with the business organization in terms of workforce impacts? 42% of our businesses indicate that they have reduced headcount. That includes any kind of headcount reduction, including furloughs and layoffs. 28% have reduced hours, and 12% have reduced hourly wages and salaries. About a third at the very bottom there have not made any changes to staffing. On the right-hand side, we wanted to understand what specifically businesses have done. So those who reduced headcount, what specific headcount reduction actions they've taken. The vast majority of people here are indicating that the actions that they've taken are classified as temporary layoffs. So 73% of our businesses indicate that the reductions that they've made are temporary, which we saw as sort of a point of optimism. It seems to indicate to them that once things are able to sort of get back on track, that they will rehire their staff and truly do consider these as temporary. Only 13% consider those to be permanent layoffs. And then another, just over a third at 36% have implemented furloughs. Only 3% had terminations, 7% in another category. Those can include voluntary reductions or voluntary departures or retirements. A couple people mentioned situations where they may be an essential type of business and staff was uncomfortable coming into work, so people just weren't showing up.
Yeah, there's not a lot of silver linings in this presentation, but the combination of temporary layoffs and furlough really show us that there's confidence that businesses will come back and that those people will get their jobs back by and large. And so I think we do take that as a positive sign for the region, and it is a little bit of good news.
When we look at some of these differences by segment, those more likely to have reduced headcount, again, are for-profit businesses sort of overall. Those more likely to have reduced hours are essential businesses. That sort of speaks to what Dottie was talking about. They're not necessarily having a heyday just because they've been allowed to continue working, still seeing a fairly dramatic decline in revenue. So they've had to reduce hours as well. Those in the restaurant industry and those in the medical and health industries all likely to have reduced hours. Those more likely to have reduced wages and salaries are, again, our for-profits overall, and then those in the hospitality and tourism industry. Several comments around the fact that wages are reduced and or seasonal employees have not really been hired yet. So we're sort of on the cusp of a large season. And so we've been able to keep our permanent staff, but we're not anticipating hiring all the seasonal staff that is likely to come on board soon. For those who had headcount reductions, more likely to have made those temporary layoffs, again, are for-profits, and those in the restaurant industry. More likely to have implemented furloughs are larger organizations that have 51 employees or more. And then we get into hiring freezes. So now we're moving into whether or not we are sort of moving forward with any staff increases. 46% of our businesses indicate that they are freezing all hiring across all roles. So there are no more new staff being added, regardless of whether people are departing. 13% indicate that they have hired except for those essential or replacement hires. And 41%, which we were actually sort of surprised by, indicated that they've not made any changes to their hiring plans. So still sort of moving forward with any plans that they had. Certainly they may not have had any plans, and so therefore no changes necessary, but that was sort of a larger proportion than we were anticipating from the hiring freeze perspective. By segment, more likely to freeze across all roles, again, for-profit businesses. Those more likely to freeze across all but are essential are not-for-profit businesses, are non-essential businesses, and are larger employers with 51 plus employees. Our last section of the survey took a look at areas of concern and potential assistance. So how the government can be helpful. This was an area where we wanted people to basically select all that would apply to them. In what ways can the government be helpful to their business in the current environment? The largest proportion here you can see is 60% indicating an expansion or streamlining of the SBA loans, followed by more than half requesting payroll tax cuts. 40% would really just like a fast track or the releasing of the funding. So at the time the survey was conducted, PPP had been announced and sort of outlined. Applications started during the field period, but obviously disbursements had not yet started. So as Dottie mentioned, we wanted to make sure that all of the plans had been announced before we went forward with these, but at the time of the survey, most people were still sort of waiting to receive any kinds of benefits. Relaxation or suspension of reporting requirements for now by a quarter of people. Another quarter talk about the assistance of continuation of healthcare for employees. We had a fairly large category of other responses here, people who were able just writing in their own ideas. Those are on the right-hand side here, sort of in order from top left was the highest response to the bottom there. So the write-in that got the most play certainly was just letting us reopen, let us go back to work, reopen the economy, let us sort of regain our livelihoods, was sort of the most common way people indicated that the government can be helpful. In a very similar vein, the expansion of essential or allowed businesses. This commonly came from a lot of our construction respondents, allowing small crews on site, allowing more outdoor work, or just sort of designating additional resources and businesses as essential. Certainly the phasing that the governor has rolled out was not yet released when we were doing the study here. Any additional stimulus funding beyond SBA and PPP, people were sort of open and ready, willing, and able to accept any additional stimulus funding. Along the same lines, any kind of grant where the offset of lost revenue or the payment of utilities and regular bills that haven't gone away, anything that could sort of offset some of those losses from not being in business in a grant fashion would be helpful there. People also mentioned things like income and property tax cuts and credits, the expansion of eligibility for the self-employed. So again, we touched on this a little earlier. Not all sole proprietors are eligible for several of these stimulus packages. The unemployment insurance was not something that they could get credit for. So the expansion of potential areas of recovery for those sole proprietors. Expediting any unemployment applications and benefits. Some people sort of wrote in saying, I applied for unemployment 4 weeks ago and I haven't, received any additional information. We've all heard the stories about people not even being able to get onto the website unless they go, at 2 o'clock in the morning. So the challenges with the unemployment application certainly came through there. The reduction of the unemployment benefit, so the additional $600 that is being provided weekly to staff that are claiming unemployment was seen as a disincentive to some business owners because their staff then was essentially making more money on unemployment, and certainly that's a disincentive to come back to work. So not very huge fans of that particular benefit. Rent and mortgage freezes or forgiveness. So because there are lots of empty open buildings right now where people cannot be utilizing their space, hoping to see any kind of rent or mortgage lease payments be sort of suspended there. As we start to reopen, access to personal protective equipment, again, the consortium that the governor announced had not been sort of outlined yet. So businesses were concerned about their ability to acquire the equipment that would be necessary for their staff upon reopening. Any kind of loan or debt forgiveness, so that would include loan and debts that were in place prior to COVID and those incurred as a result of COVID. So any kind of loan forgiveness open there. Additional COVID-19 testing, certainly things that came up quite a bit. The removal or reduction of state sales tax, again, once we reopen, sort of removing that burden to restart the economy here in the area. And then any kind of hazard pay for essential employees or those that have been working all along.
So what's important about this slide for us is what happens next. So some of these things are solely out of our control that are, federal government issues, but there are things that local governments can do. And in fact, Erie County and Niagara County have already announced, for example, COVID-19 testing sites for anyone who is symptomatic. That's new this week. And we know that the PPE program that the governor has put together with the other states will also help to address these issues for businesses as they come online. So, this really we hope will help us point to sort of where we're going to get the biggest bang for our collective buck, what's going to have the biggest impact on businesses as we move forward. And as you've seen from the previous slides, not all businesses see things the same way. So what we're excited to be able to do with this data is to actually give it to the local governments and to our industrial development agencies and chambers to really look at what we can do on a micro level and things that we can control that can really help businesses thrive in the post-COVID economy. So this is really good directional information for us to move forward with.
Some further directional information, we included just a couple of the quotes that were kind of captured in those other specifies. If we start at sort of the top left, kind of at 11 o'clock there, as safely as possible, reopen any non-essential businesses as soon as possible. So that goes into our let us reopen category. This was one of the more sort of kind and docile responses that was provided. Some of them were, you know, let us go back to work in all capital letters. So a wide spectrum of people just really anxious and eager to reopen their businesses so they can begin earning money again. Again, that construction sort of perspective of allowing small distance construction crews on site. From a restaurant industry, allowing monies to be allocated in the stimulus bills for the use of the loss of inventory and the loss of income. When they think about reopening, it's essentially going to be like opening the doors again for the very first time, which is a very costly endeavor. So allowing, sort of expanding the allowable areas for where the stimulus can be applied. These two on the right-hand side here, sort of wrapping up around the clock here, marketing or public outreach to encourage the support of local business. Again, you know, once things are back open, making sure that the community sort of pulls behind and recognizes the importance of supporting the local community and all those small businesses, and making sure that any region that exists has a strong plan for reopening businesses so that people have confidence to spend money locally as well. This very large comment in the middle, we won't read the entire thing, but it's an interesting perspective, sort of highlighting the fact that Buffalo has the second largest ecosystem for startup organizations, several of which take a venture capital in order to get off the ground. And the fact that they do take venture capital can make it really challenging for them to sort of meet the criteria for PPP or other grants and loans, or their venture capital organizations don't necessarily want them to take those pieces of stimulus. So they're in a tough spot. They also tend to have zero cash reserves and need significant year-over-year growth in order to stay in business. So there just aren't a lot of programs in place to sort of address that type of startup situation. And this perspective was that losing those types of companies and sort of squashing that environment, that kind of incubator environment that exists in Buffalo, would do some lasting damage to, you know, the wonderful growth that the city has seen over the last several years. So just sort of another perspective that we've seen here a little bit is that, you know, not all of the recovery choices that are available are equally applicable to each organization. Our very last question was around the biggest concerns for the community from the impact of COVID-19. So the entirety of the survey was largely around an individual's business. We asked them to sort of scale it back to that 30,000 foot view and share with us what their concerns were for the community at large outside of their individual organization. They were asked to rank these 7 in order of importance. So the bar here, it represents those ranked number 1 most often. And you can see 35% of our businesses indicate that the potential of permanent closure of local and small businesses is their number 1 biggest concern for the community, followed very closely by the US economy. On the right-hand side in that column there, if we add together the number 1, 2, and 3 ranks all together, permanent closure and US economy still are number 1 and number 2, but then the temporary business closures and their impact on the financial situation of employees sort of raises to a number 3 most important concern for the community. At the very bottom, something that was really important to the partnership to include was the economic impacts disproportionately harming people of color, including the immigrant population and hourly minimum wage or part-time workers. Not surprisingly, we expected this to be at the bottom of the list, but not a heavy concern for people in the community. Only 3% of businesses indicate that was their most important concern. Not-for-profit organizations were more likely to sort of rank that a bit higher.
Just to put a fine point before we move on, when we do our partnership membership survey every year, a growing interest and a need that businesses identified was to diversify their workforce. So we know that that's important to business, but what you're seeing here is really the impact of COVID-19. And so how we approach moving into the future with an equity lens is going to be very important in order for the economy to recover overall. So again, not surprising, but maybe a little disappointing if I'm being totally honest.
Right. So our overarching takeaways, again, as Dottie mentioned, you know, each individual sort of entity will kind of get their hands on the data so that they can start making those sort of decisions and plans together in sort of a micro fashion. But when we look at the data and what it tells us overall for the region, the things that stand out to us are the smaller the business, the greater the risk. So time and time again, we saw that sole proprietors or very small organizations sort of being distinct from the larger organizations, not being ready to work from home, you know, having a larger impact on revenue, not being able to make any kind of investment. So the fact that they're smaller and in some cases can't even apply for some of the recovery is dramatic, as they are a pretty firm foundation of any community. The postponement of investment and anticipated decline in revenue is significant. I mean, we talked about that quite a bit when we were on those slides, but we did have that sort of one area of optimism, as the reductions are largely classified as either temporary layoffs or furloughs. So people are pretty optimistic that they'll be able to sort of reinstate everyone once we're able to reopen. Similar to the first point here, you know, our restaurants and our Main Street retail are really in dire straits and really need that support from the community to encourage local spending. So whether we're talking about campaigns to remember to buy local, or to drive people to make sure that they're spending their money as locally as possible once things reopen, to help get those businesses sort of back to where they were, whatever it ends up being, is going to be really critical to sort of the recovery effort of the region. And then as Dottie mentioned as well, you know, the advocacy at the federal level is certainly going to be necessary because state and local governments can only do so much. You know, several of the things that were on that kind of wish list of what the government can do to help cannot be fulfilled sort of independently at the regional level and will require some additional federal assistance. And as Dottie also just mentioned, you know, making sure that the equity piece, inclusion and diversity are built into the plan for recovery intentionally so that they're not lost, as people are sort of solely focused on getting back to regular business as usual. Then I'll turn it over to Laura for the additional next steps that will be undertaken as a result of this work.
Thanks, Katie. And I think both as Dottie and Katie had mentioned, some of these items we'll be working with our partner organizations to, as the purpose of the survey, identify the gaps where current resources or COVID resources either don't address or can be tweaked to address, specifically around the Main Street retail, those small businesses, underserved populations of people of color, as well as supports and assistance for industries that are currently not covered by typical resources. When we think about Industrial Development Agency or even some block grant resources, some of those smaller business may not be, and the type of industry like retail and restaurants traditionally allowed to access those resources. So as a group and in partnership with our economic development folks, we'll be addressing those. We're going to be identifying some crosstabs for deeper analysis. So as we dig into those, some of the slides you saw earlier where a category of business, maybe 50 or fewer employees, responded significantly in one of the areas. Well, let's break that out by industry sector to find out what exactly we can do at a finer grain level to help those businesses. In addition, maybe slice that data across whether businesses were considered essential or not, because that might have a significant impact on the types of resources or tools that they need. And we've also are excited to be working with UB School of Management to assist us with the report development and some of that deeper crosstab analysis. So we will be posting this PowerPoint on the partnership's website so you can access the PowerPoint as you see here. We will also be pulling together a written report over the next couple of weeks, most likely, with the help of the UB Management School, going a little bit deeper into the crosstab analysis. And if you have any suggestions for us or you have an interest area specifically, feel free to reach out to me. My email's right there, lsmith@thepartnership.org. We'll be happy to see if we can't get you some data that you need now or get your insights into the report as it's presented if you think there's something in here that we should really be calling out.
Thank you very much, Katie, for your insightful presentation, and Laura for all of your work. We are really working hard to support businesses in real time. And I just want to put a little plug in for what we are calling BNP Business Link. We are keeping a good list of resources, and more importantly, we have member companies that are willing to assist businesses. And they've told us that, and we're working to connect the need where it is. So I invite anybody to reach out to us, and hopefully you're getting our business updates as well. Before we close, I do want to again thank our partners because we really got a robust enough group of people to take this survey that we can really go deep and really figure out how to help these local businesses. And without the partnership, government, private sector, economic development agencies, and chambers of commerce, we wouldn't be where we are right now. So I want to thank everybody for being willing to work together in such a meaningful way, and we'll keep everyone posted on the progress that we are all making. So with that, please feel free to send us an email if you have a question, and as Laura mentioned, a request also, and we appreciate you giving us your most precious asset, and that is your time here today. So thank you, and have a really great day.